Thanks y'all for coming out. What we've done out here is put out just some small plots of different kinds of wheat, basically. Just to have a little bit of variety, try to make a little bit of flour out of what was available to us at the time. So this first little plot, so this is a hard red wheat. So what we didn't talk about very much in the class is the difference between hard and soft wheats. And then there's a red and white, and that's just basically the hue or the color. But the hard and the soft distinction is basically protein content. The higher the protein, the harder it is. And so there are like higher protein wheats that we just call hard wheats. Those are typically used for bread flours. Feel free to jump in on this if you'd like. And then soft ones as like pastry flours.
I mean, we've seen some high protein soft wheats and low protein hard wheats, and soft wheat is softer than hard wheat.
Yeah. So when you're testing for ripeness, like we talked about earlier, you can kind of pull it out of the head and, you know, press it with your thumbnail, you know, and I mean, this has just gotten a good soaking, so it's just softened up. But typically, you know, you can make a small indentation in that if it's a dry, hard wheat. And then the softer ones, you can just make a little bit more of an indentation in it. Or maybe it's a little bit more smushy altogether. So this is a heirloom variety from Turkey. It's called Turkey Red.
Is there a milking stage, what you would call?
The milk stage?
Yeah, milk stage.
Yeah. If somebody did want to capture milk stage, there's actually some oats just on the edge of the field over there that are at like the late milk stage. And so, like we talked about a little bit earlier in class, as the grain matures, it's going to start out milky. So you're going to be able to squish out that milk.
So it's interesting because we're, I think, latitude-wise, the same place as like Israel, Fertile Crescent area, and they have, there's in the Jewish religion, there's the counting of the Omer. There's like a start where they're looking at the milking stage of the barley, counting the Omer to, I'm not sure exactly when it is, but it's basically counting till harvest, which is really interesting because it all runs on an agricultural calendar. And I was like, wow, we're in the same place agriculturally as the Fertile Crescent where grain came from originally. So it's really interesting to me that we run that same cycle. And
yeah, absolutely. There's a great link between at least a Jewish tradition and
and like just that story of the beginnings of wheat, that we're there. So when we grow it here, it's you know, that calendar is actually always the same based on. It's not the same like our sun calendar is. It's actually based on that agricultural time. So where the grain is supposedly this year on that calendar would be the same date as last year, but not to our calendar here, but to this other agricultural calendar. Does that make sense? That it's based on that stage. So anyways. Yeah,
and so if y'all did want to go grab some heads and just kind of feel what that feels like, you're more than welcome to. Totally fine if you don't. But so just to let you know what we've got out in the field here, we've got this, so this hard red wheat, Turkey Red, basically an heirloom as far as we're concerned, has awns on it, which are a little bit hard to get off when processing. We'll talk about that and we'll run it through a machine and stuff. The next one over, the one that doesn't have awns, is a spelt variety that is like kind of supposed to be a little bit better bred and have less hull involved. And the problem with hulls is that they hold onto the seed really tight. So you run it through a machine and it's still got the hull on it. And then you have to have an extra machine. Often you can do it in a mill. Maybe you'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the milling part. But removing the hull is just an extra processing step. So getting a hull-less variety can be really important. This variety is called Maverick, and it's supposed to be like less hully, but still plenty problematic from my perspective. The one on the other side of that is einkorn, and we're not gonna actually really mess with that because it didn't germinate until the spring. And so we're gonna just let it continue to grow. It's not ready
so
yet.
it was planted in the fall?
Yep, didn't come up, didn't see it, thought it was done, and it came up in the spring and looks okay right now.
It's the most lovely variety. It's my favorite grain right now, einkorn.
Yeah.
It is just so flavorful if you ever have the opportunity of bread made from einkorn.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it when that comes around. That's more or less it. I mean, it is a pretty small plot. This isn't going to generate a lot of flour. So like we haven't talked about what yields to expect out of a certain amount of land, but like let's just say a decent yield for this turkey red is between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds to the acre. If you do the math on that, that's basically like 23 pounds per 1,000 square feet. If you were working on like 1,000.
1 acre would produce how much?
1,000, 1,500, and that's a pretty 1,500 pounds. That's
1,500 pounds of flour.
Of raw grain,
okay.
And then there's losses along the way, but and that's a relatively low yielding crop. Okay. I mean, wheat should regularly get into like the 3,000s, but like less so with heirloomy types. It sounds like you've had good luck getting high yielding, high bushel.
Oh, I don't know about high yielding, but the bread wheats are going to, they yield less than the pastry wheats, but they command a higher price. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And most of my growing experience was for animal feed, so you're getting like really high yields, and so it makes 1,000 pounds look like, pretty weak.
I think 35 to 45 bushels an acre.
Yeah, sure. So multiply that by 60. I'm not going to try to do that on the fly.
But I think on average to make flour, they would see a ton per acre.
Yeah, sure. So this variety, I don't know much about it. This is my first time working with it. Kenny Haynes, well-known organic grain grower, says he regularly gets 1,500, 1,200, 1,500 pounds off of it. So we had a really rough fall. So this is a relatively low yielding crop. We had like pretty small seed heads. These are kind of small seed heads. So we got less than 1,000 pounds per acre, or yeah, even though if you do the math. And that's okay. It just is what it is. We would have liked to grow more and get like some seed and put it back for next year, but it all went into the bread we're gonna eat later. So if that's your crop, we've kind of talked about like the basic production details, like nutrients, how you're gonna get it in the ground and all that fun stuff. And I will say, getting it in the ground and like getting a crop to this point is really easy to do. As long as you like got your weeds under control and don't have any huge pest problems. This is like fairly straightforward. And then harvesting it is the next step. Also, not that big of a deal. It's the processing it into getting it out of the hull, out of the grain head. That's like kind of like where most of the work is. So any scythe users here? Anybody ever spend any time using a scythe? Well, this is like just an average modern scythe. So the idea with this scythe compared to like the older scythes that you might see with like that's actually a bent piece of wood is that they're made to be lighter. There's like the steel up top out front is going to be better, and then the handle's lighter, so you're less likely to kind of get worn out doing the job. But this is not like a high-end scythe. There's nothing really particularly fancy about this. Scythe care, and by the way, I'm just sort of highlighting a scythe because it's like pretty accessible to a small-scale grower. There are plenty of other options that you could do if you're a small-scale grower. For example, I have 1,000 square feet of my house that is really easy to run an extension cord to and cut with a hedge trimmer. And you just zip, 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 and you're done. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's like so easy to do, and lays it down pretty nice. So if this is like your even lower tech alternative, it's these are becoming more common, like pretty easy to get a hold of these days. Just like a pretty affordable used one like this. Sharpening is key. Definitely pay attention to how sharp these things are. Like if you're doing this regularly, like you're probably sharpening it every 15 to 30 minutes, something like that. And sharpening is, once you got a good edge on it, it's not like it takes very long. You can just, run your sharpening stone down there a few times, get the burr off the back, and then get back to it. And there are some nice stones that like sit in a little holster right here that you can kind of just.
They actually have water in the holster,
yeah.
So it's a wet stone. You carry the water with it, which is pretty cool.
And so typically, like if you were to look back at how scythes were used to harvest grain back in the day, this is just kind of set up for mowing grass right now. So this doesn't have like the grain harvesting hardware, which is basically, and maybe you've seen pictures of this, like a series of sticks that stick up about like this, and like their particular placement in relation to like how high or low you're cutting is pretty important for just getting it to lay down in a windrow. It's really easy to do without that hardware. It's just helpful to have if you're doing it in any quantity. You're more than welcome to give this a try. So we're just gonna do a quick demo and then you can see what it's like for yourself.
Yeah, we have a video about using a scythe. He was actually cutting rye, and his technique was so good he could have been harvesting it. It was green, but his technique, he was laying it down nice and flat and straight.
So generally you kind of get maybe like you can cut a 6-foot swath pretty well at a time. So this is maybe a 10-foot wide plot. So you kind of be needing to go through twice. It's pretty straightforward, right? So you're just going to kind of come in the side and then undercut. It all lays down in the same direction. And that way, let's just say I was only going to be moving forward, not like trying to cut that, then you can kind of just step over it. It drops down in these like regular intervals. And then you just kind of like walk forward, and then you can come back and bundle it up as you go. So that's the basic technique. You might have gathered this in the beginning, but I happen to be like a fan of mechanizing if you're gonna try to do anything at scale. So my ideal would be to have like a harvester on front of a walk-behind tractor or something like that. Or maybe just a side sickle bar hanging off the back of a tractor, something like that.
If you were just trying to grow 25 pounds for yourself to bake once in a while throughout the year, you probably wouldn't do that. You'd probably watch the video and put the side blade on right and do that. You know?
Yep, 1,000 square feet. You know, you might be able to get 25 pounds out of. So, I mean, pretty small, pretty accessible. There are harvest losses, you know, kind of like every step of the way, every time it gets handled, every time it runs through a machine, you're gonna lose something. Or whether it's in a machine or like any other low-tech way of getting the grain out of the seed head. So I'll set this down real quick just on like, you know, getting it off the ground. In my opinion, having to cut and then bend over again, you know, to pick it up and then handle it another time is just an added step, which is why I happen to prefer, you know, basically a direct harvest through a machine if possible. I appreciate it if you're into the labor of it, but when bundling, it's ideal to have your seed heads pretty much all at the same height because it's easier to process. If you're running it through a thresher, for example, you can just feed in the tippy top with just the seed heads on it and you don't have to run all the straw through it. But if you're kind of just going for economy, you might end up, you know, just sort of bundling it all together, and then depending on the type of thresher you have, you might be able to just run the whole thing through like you might find on like a modern combine that takes everything all at once and runs it through. So I'll go ahead and grab this. So getting it out is the next step, which is like a little bit of a hassle. In my opinion, the most labor-intensive part of the process. So we can talk about a few options for that. So like one, and we could experiment with this. This isn't gonna thresh out very well because it just got rained on. Like when you are threshing, you want this to be about as dry as you can get. It just kind of cracks open instead of, you know, having all that moisture hold things together. But like the simplest method might be to like stick a tarp out, like the tarp that's behind you, and just get your, you know, have your buddies over and you have like a stepping party, you know, which is like an old school way of doing it. There are actually little flails that are like, you know, kind of like nunchucks that people use to just like beat on like a threshing floor, right? That's like old and simple. If you wanted to modernize just a little bit, you could go with a Rubbermaid. It works really well with a lot of other grains. Small grains happen to be like, for whatever reason, if you think about pretty much any other grain, it's really easy to get it out of the husk or the shell or the pod or whatever. But for whatever reason, these are just held on there really tight. It takes like a good bit of rubbing like that to kind of get it all out of the seed head. So, you know, you could pile all of your seed head / straw into a Rubbermaid and you kind of do a little dance, kind of rub the bottom all out, and then you put it into a winnowing, some sort of mechanism to winnow. Is everybody familiar with winnowing? Okay, well.
I winnow out of our mill room door. We have an air curtain, 8-foot door with it, and I just this week got samples from my growers, and so I take the grain and it comes in dirty and I pour it from bucket to bucket with that air curtain on, and it blows all the trash out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so winnowing can be really, really simple. It could be a fan and 2 buckets where you're like pouring from one bucket to the next, and you know, all that chaff just kind of blows off. And then the heavier stuff doesn't move as well. You need to like increase your airspeed or kind of play with some settings on where you're holding the bucket, that kind of thing. Another method that works fairly well, like once you get it to this stage, so let's just say you've threshed it. Okay, and this is just low technology, is to take a hula hoop, window screen, and you can kind of just like shuffle, toss it up, you know, on a windy day, not right now. Chaff blows off, and then, you know, the grain just comes back down and you catch it. You do that, you know, over and over. It's kind of like a batch process. It's not continuous, which is why the bucket method is a little bit better, because it's just like continuous. You can just keep it flowing. You don't have to do it just a little bit at a time. So anyway, I mean, the hula hoop works really well. It's super easy to get to that point, you know. And I encourage anybody who wants to do this to be just as creative as they can with finding good ways to get this out. The first wheat crop I did before I worked in grain farming, literally just by hand, you know, took like probably about that amount and just kind of rubbed that out just like that. And, you know, slowly but surely you can get that grain out of there, and then carefully winnow. This is why I don't like awns.
Yeah, they're really a pain.
I would try for an awnless variety if you ever had the choice. You could also, so this is just a homemade machine. It doesn't work perfectly well, but it does all of those things for you. We can run it and try running some through and see what it does, but basically,
the drier stuff?
we can just try this and see what happens, and then maybe run the wet stuff through. But a machine, I mean, a threshing machine is a pretty straightforward thing, and when it comes to mechanization, you kind of just throw as much power on there as you can and hope for the best. And so this up here has a threshing cylinder, and the way that these work is the threshing cylinder itself spins, it kind of rubs up against a mating surface that kind of matches it. This one doesn't have enough surface area on that like mating surface to effectively get small grains out. It works pretty well for other grains, but small grains are just tough. But so what happens is it just kind of runs through here, spits it out the back. There's a fan in the back that blows chaff, and then eventually, like, you know, your beet straw out here, and then it kind of runs down, and you can play with screens however you'd like, whatever size grain. If you got it, it's going to stay in the hull, then you might want to, you know, have basically size your screen appropriately. Or maybe you're concerned about, maybe you got a really weedy crop and you don't want to drop all those weed seeds back in the ground. You could screen out your weed seeds, that kind of thing, as you feed it all through. Ideally, this would be stuck on the back side of something that's going to harvest it for you, in my opinion, so that you don't have to batch, pick it up, run through, batch, pick it up, run through.
Hence the word combine.
Combines those three things, yep. And yeah, then just choose the appropriately sized screen, depending on whatever your goals are. And, you know, something like this can be, you know, these screens can double for sorting out once you've dehulled. You know, you can kind of break things out by different sizes and that sort of thing. Pretty straightforward, simple machine that doesn't work great for small grains, but gets the job done. Just kind of depends on where you are in that kind of technology spectrum. If, you know, this seems appealing versus you wanting to just kind of do everything by hand, low tech, no extra energy added.
Did you ever try the other thresher?
Nope, it's not in the basement anymore.
You're kidding. Oh, they took it to the barn.
Yep. Yeah, it works on the same principle, except it's treadle powered, which is one of these. And it doesn't actually have the part that mates with the back of the threshing cylinder is called the concave, and it doesn't have a concave on it. So basically you're relying solely on just beating it instead of like this has a rubbing action like that. That's the idea anyway. But so we can just run some grain through, and then you can see what comes out the back. And then talk a little bit more about, you know, getting this grain cleaned up and then where it goes from there, which is into processing, milling, that sort of thing. So I'm just gonna fire it up real quick. So that's more or less just how it's going to capture whatever's in there. What comes out the backside looks like this. So this was threshed earlier before it got really wet. So getting it cleaned up through here or from this point is about as straightforward. I mean, you can just winnow it several more times, screen out a lot of this coarse material, you know, use screens and a fan. Or you could create your own winnowing thing if you really wanted to like get sort of precise with it. But getting rid of that isn't like a huge deal, or most of the coarse material. But the part that's a pain in the neck is just getting rid of the husk with the awns attached. So that can be done with a mill to a certain extent.
And are there any grains there that don't have the husk off? You have grains that are still covered by the husk?
Sure, this spelt, for example, I mean,
So would you run that back through again, or how would you deal with that?
I would run it through a mill or a dehuller, which do the same thing.
He means
Yeah,
the
and
flour.
like our mill, like the mill that we have at Living Lab wouldn't do it, but our mill at the mill
Yeah.
would, because it runs through the bolter and the husks. But we're also screening it. I don't know if we didn't have screens if it would actually dehull it or not. Like what would happen? You know, I've never tried that because we mill the malted barley and it dehulls it, in buckwheat it'll dehull it, but we've got screens in too.
Yep. Yeah, hulls are a pain in the neck to work with. I mean, it's like wheat's natural state is to have this hull. We bred it out of it. And so the varieties that we have that don't have hulls are our work, you know. So the ones that are less bred, like spelt, for example, are gonna.
But what about einkorn? It's hull-less, right?
Is it?
I don't know. Is it?
So I thought it had a hull.
Does it? Didn't know that.
Unfortunately, we're not far enough along with our crop to look and be able to
Yeah.
tell right now, right?
Yeah.
So emmer and einkorn, because they're the two originals, right? And spelt is maybe off of those two, right? It was like a natural cross or something.
For the
So einkorn and emmer are hold grains.
It's my understanding that like all the other triticums are just, I mean, even these wheats, you know, the wheat that we have can have hulls on it. We just have done a good job of getting all the modern
And
varieties.
turkey's pre-Borlaug. I mean, it's like it came over in the late 1800s and it's hull-less. So
Yeah.
there was
We've been working on it for a while.
and stuff. Yeah, naturally. I'm curious about that. Like, what naturally happened and what did we push along?
Yeah. Sure.
You know,
You never know by now, you know.
right?
Yeah, we may never know. Any questions about field stuff? Harvesting? We haven't talked a whole lot about planting. I mean, we did see pictures. I think that everybody's familiar with how, you know, a push seeder works. That little push seeder right there is a no-till push seeder, which basically just means it's heavy and it has a double disc opener instead of like a Johnny's or an Earthway that doesn't have the double disc and is really light. We set a seed drill out here just in case anybody wanted to look at it, but they work on the same principle except there's just a bunch of them instead of just one. Double disc and
Get into the ground really easy because they're heavy.
Yep.
And they got a tractor pulling them, so.
Yep.
I mean, actually, you didn't think you could really use that on no-till. You could use it on bare no-till land, but you didn't think it would work that good on if there was any kind of full,
yeah, vegetation or residue. Yeah.
too much to get through.
Yep. No, I have tried both ways with that particular no-till planter, and it does not cut through residue unless you add maybe a couple 100 pounds or something.
So what do you think, Mark, about if somebody didn't have that kind of equipment? I think it probably the spacing would be an issue of just doing what we do with cover crops. Just sow, put the seed out, and then mow whatever's there on top of it and letting it come up. Do you think that'd be relatively productive, or they'd be too close together and too far?
If you're trying to no-till, then that's the way to go. Sow and mow.
It works very well for cover crops. You just sow your seed out on top of whatever's in that bed. It could be crop residues, weeds, cover crops, and then you come through and mow or roll that vegetation down on top of it. That mulches it, and in a rainy year, it works great. Last fall with the drought, didn't work very well at all, but usually it works quite well.
How does it work in organic systems in terms of, like, I still don't quite fully understand why the no-till folks are not, that they can't do it organic, because my understanding is that the weed action would smother. So how does that?
It works fine if you have enough vegetation out there. We do it all the time and get pure stands of everything.
Really? So
It's just like if you have this much stuff and you sow into it and knock it down, the weeds aren't getting up through it, but the grain's like, you know, right prime. It's sitting right up top.
So you're seeding it, then you're mowing it.
Yeah.
Like you seed, mow,
Yeah.
and then the
Pops up. Yeah.
and then and is that's a fall planting thing?
Well, you can do it in the spring too, if you have a finishing cover crop, you know.
You're talking for cover crops.
Yeah, but I think it would probably work for grain
even-
too, don't you think?
To sow and mow?
It would be
Pardon?
To sow and mow?
Yeah. So if you had, let's say you had, instead of this summer cover crop, you had finishing oats, and you wanted to sow buckwheat. In fact, that's what we just did. That's how we planted what's planted out there. You know.
so
Yeah.
you
You just sow and then knock the cover crop down or mow it down over it, and it just holds the moisture in. And that seed, which is the most up in the air, you know, it's prime place. It gets ahead of the other ones.
and the roll kill though, that's like killing it.
Yeah,
This
you're
is
killing.
just
You want to kill
mowing
that
it.
cover crop either way. You do not want it alive because it'll compete with what's coming up with the grain that you're bringing up. You know,
And it
So
won't
you-
pop back up.
not if you do it at the right time. Right now, if you mowed that stuff, the buckwheat would die because it's in flower, but the Sudex wouldn't look back. You know, it'd be just coming like that right back up again. You know, so it's got to be that it's in flower. And then, as Joel said, I don't know if he said it in the class he just taught, but we had the guy from Earth Tools out. Basically, the rolling crimping is about torturing the plant to death. You make it so that it doesn't have enough energy to start over again, so it tries to finish the seed head and it wears itself out. You know, so you have to have it at the seed finishing stage, and then that crimp doesn't kill it, but then it just wears itself out. I hope we can come up with a better metaphor because I don't like the idea of
I know
torturing
it
at the
seems
end.
really harsh.
Yeah, right. But it's very effective, and it allows us not to use Roundup and get a similar
That's what. Yeah.
impact. Yeah.
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 So perennial weeds are the main problem in the organic no-till.
Yeah. Hopefully you've smothered them out with whatever you've grown in there before. Yeah. And indeed, we'll get docks popping up through that. It's just if you have a field that's full of things like dock that are like intense perennials, if they're like this much that's in here, that's not a big deal. I think how much dock you had in this batch of grain, but if it's like 10 times that, then just don't grow your grain. Go out there and get the dock out. You know, and of course, if you're somebody who's only using tractors, you're going, well, I got to use Roundup then because I couldn't possibly go out there and pull it. You know, so or tillage, some other way to kill it. But you do have to kill those kinds of things. Not that density, but greater densities. You know, so this is talking about doing something that it's annual weeds that are problems, not lots and lots of perennial weeds. You know.
Any questions, y'all? Cool. Well, that's pretty much it for the field stuff. We can head back and get to milling.
Well, actually, we're going to look at the compost for a minute. Remember? Just talk a little bit about fertility.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we're just going to come out here, go across the street by my car, and walk out to the compost for a minute. Do a quick little demonstration of that, and then head on. Basically, we were pretty disappointed with the yield, and then I called up my friend Kenny Haynes, and we were talking yields, and he got, we got 500 pounds, he got 1,200 to 1,300 pounds, and he was talking about how he had, applied chicken litter in the fall, came back with Chilean nitrate in the spring, and actually would have had a better yield if the Chilean nitrate had arrived at time, because you want to feed something like Chilean nitrate early when it's too cold for other nutrients to be available. And so he's got a plan to get a really good yield, which he needs to because farmers have to get a lot of yield to make money. And at the very end, he just mentioned, of course, there are years that I don't get 500 to 700 pounds, and I immediately zeroed in on that. So what kind of years? He said, well, Pat, it's too wet or too dry. And bingo, we had a drought last year, and that affected it. But it would have probably been better if we'd put more compost down. We put some down, right? But if you can give it a bigger feed to start with, it's going to like that, It's going to be able to make a bigger plant and be able to put more roots down in the winter, So making compost on this kind of scale is worth doing if you're trying to really get any kind of real production. And this obviously requires a loader, but literally you could rent a Bobcat. It doesn't cost that much if you know how to work one. You can learn pretty quick too. And have some, dairy farmer or somebody deliver you a nice big pile of manure, saving all of the other kind of high carbon scraps you have and stuff, and just stockpiling stuff and make a pile, maybe not this big, but half as big, and do a whole area. The principle on this pile is these pipes on the bottom go all the way through. The holes, normally they're drainage pipes for septic systems. The bottom part of this doesn't have holes, the top does. So we set them the opposite way, and as the pile heats up, and it's got lots of structure, we put a lot of wood chips in there for two reasons. One, for structure, another to help fungi to do well. And as it heats up, it pulls the cool air through. And because the heat can move through this, because it's got the air spaces, the structure, chimney effect takes place, and you have an an aerated wind system without having to turn it. So what you want to do is you want to make sure your pile is going to get hot before you put it on there, because it's a lot harder to deal with it once it's on there. So this pile sat right over there for a week. Actually, it would have been good to put it on sooner, but we just had various things that kept us from doing it. Then it was moved over here. Fortunately, because we had so much structure, it was breathing and getting the air it needed otherwise. Compost doesn't get air, it goes anaerobic, and the temperature will spike for a moment, but then crash if you do it that way. So the ingredients in this, the big deal for us was to have enough carbon, because normally we make really high bacterial compost and we get really fine, and we made essentially fertilizer. But it doesn't really at all favor the fungi. And the longer we listen to Dr. Ingham and talk to other people who know about soil ecology, you really want a high fungal component in your compost if you want to have less weeds and put that incredible power of the fungal hyphae, which does a lot of mining for you, getting minerals and stuff. So to accomplish that, we saved all the stalks from our greenhouses, added them in. Much to my chagrin, I thought there's this thing called carbon-nitrogen ratio, so it's like 1 is always nitrogen, and then carbon's the other number. You always think of 1 part nitrogen to maybe hay, 25 parts carbon, straw, maybe 60 parts carbon, wood, maybe 200-300, maybe even 600. We were looking to get someplace up in the high 80s or 90s or low hundreds, so that the carbon would be around through the whole processing and the fungi would have something to work on. We didn't really, it turned out that all of our stocky stuff that I thought was so high carbon was less than 50. So we went with wood, which it's very ironic because I've been keeping wood out of my compost and teaching to keep wood out of compost forever. What's changed is I used to think of compost as a source of organically made nutrients. And now the nutrients come from the cover crops, right? I want inoculant. I want inoculant, and I want stable carbon that can be incorporated by the life of the soil to build humus. And so I'm not going to be tilling it in. I'm doing no-till. If the wood is on top of the soil, it's no problem. Though we will sift a lot of this out and use it in our next pile. It'll be like inoculant, and it'll break it down even more. But the way I got comfortable with it, we had Gabe Brown present at the grower school, and he's brought his soils. He's accomplished a bunch of powerful things. The one that's most amazing is his soil used to be able to take a ½ inch of rain an hour. Now it can take like, I think, 8 or 11 inches or something like that. But the other thing he did was get his organic matter up to 8%, and that's way high. And he said, I haven't told anybody this yet, but the secret is I regularly lightly spread wood chips on the pastures. And then the animals come through, and it's mob grazing, so they're urinating and defecating on them, and it slowly builds the carbon. You know, it rots real slowly, but it's not being put way down, so it's not robbing nitrogen. And that's what we're going for here. So this is very high carbon dairy manure, which had loads of corn stalks in it. It's the best. If you can find a farmer who beds their cows on corn stalks, that's the best compost made. We had a pile like this for a composting workshop. It was nothing but that manure and corn stalks in it, and it ran for weeks and weeks. A pile like this could run for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that, not having to be turned. So it's just pulling the air through. And right now the cover is off because the one hard thing is we got it good and wet when we started, but then we had a bunch of dry time. And if it gets too dry, it'll die. And so I checked right here. I made a little hole to see how it was doing. And we're doing good on heat. The problem is, even with all the rain we've had, the one day it didn't rain this week, in the days of rain, it was sunny and very windy. And so it's drying out as fast as it gets wet. We might have to put a sprinkler on it. The way you tell if it's ready, if it's wet enough rather, is when you squeeze it really hard, you get like 1 or 2 drops. I couldn't get 1 or 2 drops out of this if I was Hercules. You know, so it's not, it's moist enough right at the surface, but we're probably gonna have to, you know, unless it rains a lot more. And that's okay, we can let this get over wet on the outside, then cover it, and the moisture will even itself out. You know. But somehow or another you have to figure out the moisture, and probably the best thing to do if you were doing this would be to run drip tapes over it. So you're slowly moving the water through and not like running lots of water, most of it's running off and washing nutrients off. You know. And then as soon as you have the moisture right, we have this cover here, which is like very heavy row cover. It's spun bound. And because it's spun bound densely, the rain is shed by it, but it can breathe. And that's perfect for a compost pile. Compost pile, if we set it up so it couldn't breathe, we'd lose that chimney effect. You know, but because we have this setup, it could actually breathe and hold the moisture in pretty well, but it will dry out that way too because it is breathing, so when it breathes, it's also respiring. But that's it, you know, that's the compost pile. You can do this on a home scale with pallets. Just have the pallet with the smallest holes in it be the floor. And then put a bunch, likewise on this, a lot of our brush went right on top of the pipes to kind of make a plenum, to allow that air to move in. So you put your stockiest stuff on the bottom on top of those little holes, and then throw your pile on top. Put the, have the other pallets around the sides, close it up, and your pile will run for, I had a pile, just a pallet size, run for 8 weeks once at Dig In Garden. I was teaching a class. And I monitored it and ran for 8 weeks. So it's a way to get a pile to run hot on a home scale and not have to turn it. If you're looking for great compost, this pile would be turned once to get the stuff that's on the outside into the center. It would heat up and not run nearly as long, probably.
Do you have any issues with snakes or yellow jackets or things that would want to make their home in your compost?
Not if you're doing it like this, because it stays too hot. You've got to always move it. The average home compost pile is a great place to get snakes, hornets, and it's like a reproductive center for rats. If you're not getting your food value waste to heat up really fast, it's just sitting there slowly composting. Yes, it's composting well, and it'll be fine stuff eventually. I mean, it might even go anaerobic, but you put it in the soil and nature will fix that, but you can't stop the rats from going crazy.
And so the solution?
Get a pile to run hot. Do that pallet thing. I really recommend for home composters that if you're dealing with your food waste, make a worm box.
Really?
Yeah, because the average home person doesn't have enough food waste to get a big pile to get hot. Make a pile once a year when you clean up your garden. Then you have all the materials, you can get a good big hot pile. You use that for your potting soil, you use that for your planting mix, and you rely on cover crops. And then worm castings, and that's, the worm castings, you can make a rat-proof box. It works really well for probably 9 months out of the year. The other 3, stockpile your stuff. You could actually have a thing called bokashi, where you're actually pickling it. And then it could sit until the next fall when you made your next pile. You can just get the free buckets from Engels, your food waste all goes in, you spread this EM saturated rice bran on it, and it pickles it. It won't smell, it won't cause problems. Next fall, when you're ready to make your pile, you got a bunch of material. That's your 3 months worth. If you got a place to have 3 months worth of compost sitting there. That's the one issue. It doesn't work too good in an apartment. Okay, I think we're good. Let's head back to the bread.